So I think you've touched on so many great points there. I definitely see that there's been a lot of fear-mongering tactics throughout history that unfortunately leverage government to work for the few, not the many.
That's right.
So looking forward, we definitely want to inspire our civic systems to fight for justice. So looking forward, where do you see the opportunities to enhance our civic systems to fight for justice looking forward?
So I always start with ourselves. So it's easy with issues of the big kind of seemingly intractable issues that we're facing in our society to kind of point fingers at everybody else and what they're doing. When in fact, the system that we keep talking about, whether we're talking about racism or whether we're talking about sexism or classism or any of these other things, climate change, that there's an individual responsibility as well as a collective responsibility, as well as institutions and these larger systems. And when we are constantly pointing our fingers at other things, what we're really doing is trying to absolve ourselves of our responsibility. So for things like racism, we have to have, it's actually built on top of, just like emergencies are built on top of the issues that have previously existed, racism is sitting on top of issues that previously exist in our society in terms of our overall culture and how we frame things. So we are not a naturally introspective culture. It is not this is not the Western way, right? And so the idea of self-awareness and self-reflection is not as prominent as it needs to be, because without that element, right, it's harder to have humility. It's harder to see that we're all just people, and when we are flawed, and that's okay. But that's part of the human condition, and it's part of the human struggle. And the idea is not to try to be perfect, but the idea is try to be the best version of yourself that you can be. And in that framing, then that means that the work that we need to do around having a basic level of self-awareness, who am I? What do I believe in? Where do I stand on these issues? Why do I stand in those positions on these issues?
How am I seen? What is my behavior that I may not be aware of?
Exactly, because those thoughts and the way that we have taken on certain positions on issues impacts what we do, right? It impacts our behavior. And not just as individuals in terms of interpersonal interactions. It does that too, right? Because we know that the segregation, not just physical segregation in terms of where we live, but also in terms of our social networks, our real social networks, is very racially segregated, right? And so you layer that on top of all of this and the fact that we're not self-aware, that it's hard for us to, our default as human beings in terms of how our brain actually works is to try to protect us. And part of protecting us is to make us feel better about ourselves, right? And so it means that it's easy for us to see the issues in other people than it is to see it in ourselves. And when we're trying to deal with issues of racism, whether it's the interpersonal stuff and the microaggressions and all of that, or what's happening in institutions and what's happening across our culture, this role of who we are and how we're walking into spaces matters. And so the individual responsibility, the work that we have to do on ourselves is necessary in order to even get to, okay, now what do we do?
Can we talk about that for a second? Because,
absolutely.
First of all, this problem of people deflecting responsibility, I think, is very deep. And we've talked among ourselves about how that instinct is, if only people over there would do something. And I'm fine. I have good intentions.
Oh, yeah,
I have
I'm
this.
awesome. Progressive Northeast.
I'm Progressive Northeast.
Yeah.
And as I think about it and as I observe these conversations, or in many cases, the lack of conversation, at least part of it, I think, comes from well-intentioned white people who are nervous that they're going to say something that will suddenly be painted as skewed, racist, and then they won't know what to do. And so part of the defensive reaction is to say as little as possible and not to engage with this and to assume that the core of the problem is somewhere else. So how, and part of what you said is there's this unconscious piece too, when it's very hard to be aware of what you're unconscious of. So how can, in creating the world we want, how can we start to break that down? How can we invite all people, but particularly communities, white communities, to address these questions with more courage and more confidence that even if people, they make a mistake or say the wrong thing, that's almost the point, is to get it out and have people, and then listen to what others are thinking. So I'd love to hear, we want, as part of this show, to really think about what steps could we take to start breaking this down. And I know that the work you're currently doing after the chief resigns is really helping people do that. So you want to offer some ideas about that?
Absolutely. So as a nerd, I own that very much so. And I was told, actually, I was in North Carolina at the beginning of the summer doing a workshop. And one of the women said, an alternative framing for nerd is intellectual rock star. I thought that was, I was like, so there you go. That's an alternative for you if you decide to use it. So I still say nerd. And I was just literally last night doing some additional research for a project I'm working on. And I came across this article that was really helpful for me in connecting some dots. And it basically said that our ability to learn and grow is very much connected to our level of consciousness. And actually, it's a pathway to consciousness as long as we have a growth mindset. And I was like, okay, so these are things that we talk about kind of anecdotally, but there's actually research now that's backing up this idea that if we are open to learning, if we're open to taking a step back, slowing down long enough to let our conscious mind get ahead of our unconscious mind, that we can actually change our behavior, right? And to give ourselves some alternative options outside of what we would do by default, right? Because by default, we're biased, we're confused, we're misinformed, we're usually operating from a position of fear and anxiety.
Yeah, nervousness,
right? Yeah. And so when we think about what do we do, so the first piece is just accepting that, like, that's who we are as people. Like, and when you're trying to help people understand these issues, being clear, like, this is a shared struggle. No one's calling you a racist, right? That's not my approach. My thing is, this is a struggle that we're all having because of how we've been raised, because of how we've been taught, because of how we've navigated the world in order to get, you get along to go along, or what's the saying, right?
Go along, get along.
Go along to get along. Yes, there you go. I'll get it together.
Beacon Hill.
Exactly. And so all that said, it's really important that folks learn, leave the space open to learn, just in acknowledging that we're just people and having that humility, being able to listen, and not just listen to wait for your turn to rebut, but listen to learn.
Or prove that you're smarter.
You're so super smart, right?
Right.
But listen to actually learn from other people, because what is really amazing about when we allow ourselves to be a little vulnerable and uncomfortable is when we have our greatest learning, when we have our greatest evolutions and growth as people. That space of discomfort is the space for growth. And to help people understand that and go through a process that allows them to build the kind of relationships and networks that are important to being able to not just learn and grow, but to continue to do this work. For white people, it's really easy to start on this journey and then get off the path, right, when it gets hard.
Ooh, that's going to make me
Ooh,
I'm uncomfortable. Yeah.
So, and a lot of people don't have networks of folks a lot of white people don't have networks of folks who are really talking about these issues, right, in a meaningful way. And so helping folks be connected to one another on this journey is really, really important, and to normalize it. It's okay to make mistakes. You're going to, right? The idea isn't that you fixate on the mistake. You fixate on the lesson you learn from the mistakes. So my mom always says, take the lesson, not the loss, right? And so I offer that to folks, right? And the other piece is to, you kind of mentioned this earlier, which is to listen when people of color are saying they're having certain experiences. Because the default reaction is to put the burden on the person of color to prove it, as opposed to kind of just listening and accepting that that's an experience that they had and letting that be a truth that can exist amongst other truths. So it can be true that a person of color had an experience that was an attack on their identity. And it can be true that a white person that they engaged in that did the thing didn't mean to do it. Both of those things can be true and exist together. And the idea is that we're able to work through them so that folks can learn.
I had a quick question. So you've mentioned community here, and I think that's what we're trying to do with our show, and what you've been trying to do a lot in the city of Boston is to build a sense of community. Are there any specific kind of policy initiatives that we could bring people together that you've kind of discovered for the city of Boston?
I'd like to add a piece to that.
Yeah.
Just so I have gone through the anti-oppression training, and I found it incredibly valuable. However, I think some people resist the idea of doing it because of the name. In other words, you start on the back foot feeling like the first thing I have to admit is all these terrible things I did that I'm not even aware of. So part of it, and I know it's ridiculous at some level to have to reassure people who are causing the problem. If I can just mention personally, growing up with a chronic illness with leg braces, I spent a lot of time reassuring people that it was okay to talk to me, and I found that to be exhausting.
It is very exhausting.
And yet, part of what Tom's asking is what's the pathway to engaging people and to helping them pass into that kind of humility and willingness to be exposed to new things that might be painful.
Yeah, so I think, so in addition to the self-awareness, I think the thing that I've seen to be most helpful is, again, this idea that this is not a struggle that's unique to you. Because what we really oftentimes see is that people think like the kind of range of thoughts that are happening in their brain are unique to them, when it's actually a reflection of our larger societal culture. And that what's happening in their head is happening across many people, and that there is an opportunity to manage it and manage how it impacts our behavior. And so by creating that shared experience and normalizing it and saying, that is normal, and here's the next step, the next opportunity for you in being able to do this. Learn about the full range of history. For every inequity that we see in communities of color, there's a set of historical stories that explains it, but we don't learn those in school. Secondary, high, when you get to higher education, we're not really learning those unless you seek it out. And so that's the beginning place so that folks can understand why, and that it's not just about individual behavior, right? That who we are is a reflection of not just who we want to be, right? And all of our individual actions. It's a reflection of our families, of our communities we grew up in, the institutions that we touched directly, the institutions that we don't touch directly, but that have influence on what we have access to. And so from a policy perspective, the idea is that in institutions, acknowledging that when people walk through the doors of institutions, they bring all that stuff with them. So we pretend that we're somehow a different person when we walk through the thresholds of doors of institutions. We're now a professional. And in that role, I'm doing my job, right? But we still are who we are when we're doing our jobs. And all of the bias and all of the default stuff that sits with us, that we've all been taught, plays out in how we make decisions about policies and about programs, about how we even put them together, who's at the table, who's not at the table, right? Especially if you think about how segregated our networks are, right? And how that plays out in institutions. So from a policy perspective, organizations have to figure out how do we buffer ourselves from ourselves, really, right? Our default ways of being. And so that takes professional and personal development, work in the institution to let folks know that this is a serious issue that the organization is committed to, that we are investing in, and that we're going to make sure that folks understand that commitment through bringing them through the process with us.
Now, could I ask you a little bit more personal question? You
Sure.
mentioned before the array of microaggressions that are the ways in which people unconsciously say things, do things. Could you give us some examples? You've been in the Air Force, you have had major positions. You have put yourself directly into these flow, and I'm sure you've had some of your experiences.
Yes. I'll give you some low-end ones and some higher-end ones.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So some low-end ones when I was in the military. So keep in mind that, you know, a lot of folks in the military are coming from the Midwest, right? In the Midwest, there's not very much diversity. And so this is the first time they're ever in environments where there are people who don't look like them. And they don't really know anything about them except for what they've seen on TV and conversations that they've overheard. And so I've had everything from folks wanting to touch my hair. Can I touch your hair? And then I'd have to tell them no, and don't ever ask a person of color to touch their hair because they may not understand where you're coming from in the way that I understand what your experience is, and it'll cause problems. Oh, you listen to that music? As in shock that I would listen to rock. Oh my goodness, right? All the way to, I was at one event that I had to travel to, I won't say where, and I was in almost the VIP area where all the speakers were and kind of the important people for this event. And there were probably about, I don't know, maybe 300 or 400 people that were waiting for us to speak. And it was we were on a break. So we're in the room and there's wait staff in there. And so I come in and this white woman walks up to me and she says, oh, and then she tries to hand me her plate. And I just looked at her. Now, I'm in a suit. I dress the same, right? All the time. I'm always in a suit, either a turtleneck or a button-down shirt with a scarf tie. Like I always wear my scarves like a tie. So this particular day I had my scarf tie on with my vest, the suit. So clearly, if you're conscious and you're paying attention, don't work there. So she tried to hand me her plate. And I just looked at her. And to be honest, I kind of played with it a little bit. And so she started to hand it to me, and I started to reach out for it, but then I pulled my hand back and she dropped it. And I said, oh yeah, I don't work here. And then I just walked away. And later, she realized that I was the keynote speaker for the whole event. And so there are these constant interactions, and that's just the interpersonal stuff. That doesn't include the cultural microaggressions where you turn on the TV and it's just like this constant people talking about you in ways that are inaccurate, right? Talking about your identity, part of your identity in ways that constantly remind you that people don't think you're like them, that they don't respect your humanity, that you don't have the default dignity. This is just African-American woman. Yeah. And it's something that we have to deal with our children too. We have 5 children, 3 still at home. And the 3 still at home, actually all of them, early in our marriage, we had a conversation about what does it mean to raise Black children in a society that's not designed for them to succeed, that's going to constantly be filling their heads with stuff about what should be expected of them or what their limitations are, where they should go or not go, what they should do or not do. And so we made a commitment that our family culture would be the anchor that would protect them on the seas of the world, right? To keep them anchored and not get blown in any kind of direction, because it's easy to get lost in what is normal, because what's normal in this country is whiteness, right? But we don't explicitly ever say that because people don't realize that that's what normalcy means in the United States. And so as a person of color, if you get caught up in that, you lose yourself. You lose the relationship with kind of your identity, your history, all those things. And in many cases, people don't know those things. They don't know their history. They don't understand that we have made huge contributions to this country, right, in ways not just from a slavery perspective, right, being enslaved, but all throughout the history of this country that we've made huge contributions. And if you don't have that historical context, or if you don't understand that a lot of the gains that we have had as a community were initiated and led by us, right, with support of our white brothers and sisters. But we were leading those efforts. And so when you don't understand those things about your own power, about the historical context, then it's easier to get kind of lost in the wind. And so the types of microaggressions that I kind of laid out as examples, for someone who doesn't have context on like where's that coming from and why and all those things, it can make you crazy.